There are places where the wind isn't just wind. It's the breath of someone who hasn't truly left. On a quiet farm in Ontario, an old horse named Bramble never neighed, but anyone who touched his withers felt a chill like the touch of the beyond. One night, Bramble broke from his stall and stood raging outside young Ellie's window as she burned with fever. When she woke, she drew a vision Bramble carried Mom across the Silver River. But the most haunting moment came. The next morning, etched into her mother's necklace was a line no one had carved. "I'm still here just through the horse." Subscribe now to follow more haunting, heartfelt stories like this one. The camera opens on a wide-shot mist rolling over a frozen field in rural Ontario. Fences stretch like the ribs of an old world half sunk in snow. The light is soft but sharp enough to catch the breath of morning still lingering in the air. A dark figure stands near the fence line, motionless. A horse. Old, stoic. Frost clings to its mane like silver threads, and leaning against it half asleep is a little girl, Ellie, 10 years old, wrapped in a worn corduroy jacket too big for her frame. She doesn't shiver, but she doesn't speak either. Her cheek rests right against the place where the horse's neck meets its shoulders, its withers. Her eyes are open, staring at nothing, as if listening to something nobody else can hear. And that's when we see it. A subtle shift in the air like steam, but colder rising faintly from Bramble's back. The mist parts differently around that one place. It moves in spirals, not lines. The camera edges closer. The sound design is tight, nearly silent, but we hear it if we lean in. Wind. But not from the trees, not from the earth, from the horse, from its withers. She doesn't move, doesn't speak, but her eyes say she feels it. Cut to a slow pan of the field. Empty paddocks. A world suspended in grief. Then back to Ellie, now sitting up and drawing on a notepad with gloved hands. Her drawing is shaky but vivid. A horse without reins, a figure on its back, a silver river winding through clouds. There's no color, just graphite. But it hums with something more than childhood imagination. A car engine hums from far off. Ellie doesn't react. Footsteps crunch in snow. Bramble lifts his head, not alarmed, just aware. Then enters James. Old boots, older hands. Wrinkles like etched riverbeds. He doesn't carry himself like a ranch hand, more like a watchman who's seen what people forget. His hair is in a single gray braid down his back. First Nations, Ojibwe. Eyes like flint. He doesn't speak at first, just watches her from a respectful distance. "You sit there every morning?" He finally says, his voice low, but not soft. Ellie nods, but says nothing. James approaches slowly. He's not afraid of Bramble, he never is. But even he doesn't touch the horse's back. He gestures loosely toward the withers like someone pointing to a wound they know better than to press. "That's not just wind you feel," he says, glancing at her drawing. "That's a place, a crossing." Ellie frowns almost imperceptibly. He kneels beside her and places his hand above the drawing. His fingers hover, don't touch the paper. "We call it the back door, not because something escapes, because something waits." She finally speaks a whisper. Bramble doesn't talk, but it's like she listens. James turns to the horse. Bramble hasn't moved. Not once. Its eyes are open, clouded, but aware. "He's the oldest one here," James says. Never made a sound. Not even when the others cried out in the storm last winter. Ellie's hand touches her notebook, her grip tightening. Her knuckles go white. "My mom," she says, still whispering. She used to sing right before bed. Her voice. It's what I hear now. Only when I sit here. James doesn't answer. He doesn't have to. The camera shifts to a close-up of Bramble's skin at the withers. The hair ripples slightly as if something inside just exhaled. And then, nothing. Still again. The kind of stillness that unsettles even the wind. We cut to inside the main house. Photos of Ellie's mother on the wall. Smiling. Alive. A different season entirely. Green fields, warm sun. Ellie's father passes by, glancing at the photo without slowing. His eyes are hollow. There are dishes in the sink. Unopened mail. Time has slowed in that house. Or maybe it's just broken. Back to Ellie, still outside. James lights a small cedar bundle. He fans the smoke toward Bramble, not over his head, but toward the back of his neck. The smoke curls upward, then suddenly splits, dividing in two, like something unseen walked right through it. "That's where the breath leaves," James says, barely audible. "Not always just the horses." Ellie looks at him. The first time she's looked directly at another person in weeks. "Do you believe me?" she asks. James stares at Bramble for a long moment. "I don't believe he says I remember." The wind picks up, and the mist finally begins to lift. The shot pulls back Ellie and Bramble silhouetted in a half-melted clearing of snow. A still life of something ancient, something waiting. Smash cut to black. A single word appears on screen, etched in silence. Withers. The storytelling has begun. Every afternoon, as the light slides low across the barn roof and the frost thaws just enough to make the mud whisper beneath her boots, Ellie walks the same path. From the back porch across the gravel, past the fence where the other horses gather, always curious, always loud, she walks until she reaches the farthest stall. The one no one visits anymore. The one nobody ever talks about, unless they're whispering. Bramble's. He stands exactly where she left him each day. His eyes are dull, but aware like deep water. His body barely shifts, save for a twitch in the ear or a flick of the tail to swat a slow, tired fly. And always that strange drift of air from his withers, the cold that doesn't belong. Ellie sits without a word. She doesn't pet him. She doesn't brush him. She opens her sketchbook. Every page is filled. Each day, a new vision. Not imagination memory or something dangerously close to it. Today's drawing is different. Not static lines or faceless shapes. This one has detail. Intention. She draws a woman, her mother barefoot and peaceful, sitting atop Bramble without saddle or reins. Her hair flows with the wind, her hands resting gently on Bramble's mane. They are crossing something vast, a river of light. The water is silver, rippling not with current, but with stars. Ellie's pencil smudges the sky into motion, dark and soft, like smoke behind their figures. She does not look up as she draws. Her body leans against Bramble's side, and slowly, she lets her ear fall once again to that spot on his neck. The air grows cold instantly. Her eyes flutter closed, and something shifts behind them. Her mother's voice, not clear, not conversational, but there, soft, familiar, like being underwater and hearing someone call your name from the shore. She doesn't react like a child startled. She reacts like someone remembering. Bramble doesn't move. Back at the house, a man in a coat too stiff for comfort watches through the kitchen window. He sips coffee that's already cold and mutters under his breath. She's out there again. Cut to Mr. Hayes, the ranch manager, early 60s, stern, but not cruel, walks down to the barn later that day. He finds Ellie still seated, sketchbook closed, now her hand resting on Bramble's spine like it's part of her own body. "You talked to him, huh?" he asks casually, but his eyes carry concern. Ellie doesn't respond at first. Her lips are tight. Then, with a voice that isn't quite her own, she says, "He talks to me." Hayes pauses. Kneels. He talks. Ellie looks up, her eyes wet but not crying. "In my head," she says. Like, not words, just voice. It's her voice. He stiffens. "Your mother's?" Ellie nods. She's with him. She rides him across the silver water. Hayes doesn't answer right away. Instead, he stands and rubs the back of his neck. He glances toward the barn ceiling like he's hoping something smarter is hidden in the rafters. "You've been through a lot," he mutters, half to her, half to himself. "It's natural to..." Hold on. Ellie doesn't speak again. Later that evening, the kitchen feels colder than it should. Ellie's father is on the phone with a doctor. A family therapist, maybe, or a trauma counselor. Mama. She's not talking to us. She's drawing these things, and now she says the damn horse is speaking in voices he says. It's not grief. It's dissociation. He listens, nods, rakes a hand through his hair. "Yes, I'll bring her in. We need someone to get her out of that barn." Back at school, another set of eyes has started watching. Grace Reynolds, art teacher. Quiet, deliberate, a woman who's been through her own quiet wars, holds up Ellie's latest turned-in sketch. It's not a homework assignment, just something Ellie left behind on the desk. Grace stares. The imagery is eerily specific. A woman in white with no face. Symbols drawn around her, geometric but fluid, inked like old bone carvings. On Bramble's chest in the drawing is a handprint made of water. The lines spiral outward in a way that reminds Grace of something she once saw in a museum far from here. A symbol carved into stone by a people long gone, but not forgotten. She rummages through a drawer and finds an old book, echoes of sky and soil symbols of the northern tribes. Page 76, there it is. Same handprint, same spiraling mark. Portal of return. Grace closes the book slowly. She looks again at Ellie's sketch. Then at the girl sitting alone by the window. Always alone, always silent. She doesn't speak, but something in her has begun to hum. Like the moments right before thunder. Grace doesn't confront her. Not yet. She understands something instinctively, that whatever is happening is delicate. Too loud, and it shatters. Instead, she begins to watch and listen. A day later, Ellie walks into class, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. Grace greets her with a small nod, nothing more. But when Ellie walks past, Grace sees the edge of the newest drawing. And just for a moment, her own breath catches. It's a woman's hand, reaching back from a galloping horse. Behind her, clouds of ash. In front, silver water. And underneath it all, in tiny letters, nearly invisible, she says, "Don't be afraid." The wind whistles outside the classroom window, sudden and cold. Grace turns her head toward it, and her eyes narrow, not with fear, with memory. The communion has begun, and it does not speak in language, only in silence, and silver, and cold wind at the back of the neck. There's a quiet kind of evening that slips through the pines behind the ranch, neither dusk nor night, but something in between. That's when James lights the cedar the same way his grandfather did. One small bundle, just enough to whisper to the veil between worlds. He's not the kind of man to speak unless the air around him is listening. And tonight, Grace is listening. They sit just outside the main barn, knees close to the thawing earth smoke curling around their shoulders like thin ancestral fingers. James holds a photograph between his hands, faded, nearly torn through at the edges. A horse, younger Bramble, and a woman riding bareback, arms spread wide like wings. "My sister," James says, tapping the edge. "Froze to death out past Birch Lake. Got lost after her dog ran off." Grace studies the photo. She believed in what you'd call thresholds, he says. Places that aren't just places. They're hinges between what breathes and what doesn't. He points to the spot on Bramble's back in the photo, same place Ellie always rests her cheek. "We call that Nibawawian," James says. Means the place of final warming. But when a soul doesn't want to leave, it stays, lingers in the heat or in the cold. Grace lowers her gaze. Her fingers instinctively touch the scarf wrapped around her neck. "She was the only one who called me Gracie," she says quietly. "The morning after her funeral, I woke up, and I swear I heard it, right next to my ear, just once." James doesn't smile. He doesn't doubt. "Because someone stayed behind to say it," he replies. Later that week, Grace visits the barn alone. The wind is wrong. It doesn't whip or moan, it presses. Heavy. The barn door groans as she pushes it open, and inside the world falls silent, like someone's holding their breath. Bramble stands in his usual place, head low but alert. One eye turns lazily toward her. She approaches. Each step forward feels like wading into deeper water, and by the time she reaches him, her chest is tight with something she can't name. She doesn't reach out, not at first. Just closes the distance until she's within inches of his shoulder. The air changes. She can feel it sudden and sharp, a pressure just above her collarbone behind the ears, like cold hands pressed to her neck. She gasps, not because it hurts, but because it knows her. And then, "Gracie," a whisper. Not from the horse, not from the air, from inside her, from somewhere she buried long ago. She stumbles back. Her heel catches on a feed bucket, and she nearly falls, hand gripping the side of the stall for balance. The breath leaves her lungs in one harsh exhale. She clutches her scarf again, as if her sister's voice is somehow tucked inside its weave. Outside, the wind finally moves. At school the next day, Grace finds Ellie waiting for her at the door before class even starts. "I know it spoke to you," Ellie says, without hesitation. Grace doesn't lie. She doesn't pretend. She only nods once. "I felt her," Grace says. Like she was right there. But not whole. Ellie holds out a drawing. It's a sketch of Grace standing by Bramble, a faint shape whispering into her neck. The shape has Grace's own eyes, but they're closed. "There's something about the cold," Ellie says. That's where voices go when they're not ready. That afternoon, Ellie's father arrives early to pick her up. She's not at the gate. He finds her beside the barn again, speaking quietly to Grace. He doesn't raise his voice, but his presence slices the air. "She's 10, he says firmly. "She lost her mother in a car wreck, not some ghost-ridden fairy tale. And you?" He turns to Grace, "are a teacher, not a shaman." Grace straightens. "She's grieving. And so are you. Don't preach at me. I bury it because that's what gets people through. We survive. Not sit around playing with spirits like it'll bring anyone back." Ellie's eyes drop. Her father doesn't see her fist clenching around the corner of her notebook. "She's not playing," Grace says. She's listening to what he snaps. Static in her head, the whinny of a broken animal. "She says it's her mother's voice," Grace replies quietly. "She even told me details about your wedding, about your wife's favorite book that a child her age wouldn't know." He pauses. Just a beat. A flash of something in his face, guilt, disbelief, fear. Then it's gone. Memory, imagination, don't feed it. He takes Ellie's hand, a little too tight, and pulls her away. But as they walk, Bramble lifts his head. Just once, not a full neigh, not a cry, just a rumble from the chest. Deep, quiet, but not silent. And Ellie looks back. Later that night at the edge of sleep, she whispers into the dark, "Tell her I'll come tomorrow, same time." And in the quiet air of her room, cold without cause, something moves. A rustle of warmth. A voice shaped like breath. And the faintest echo of her mother's laugh woven into the stillness like the last note of a lullaby, never finished. It started with a shiver. Small, harmless. The kind that comes before a fever blooms. Ellie had been quiet all day, quieter than usual. Her face pale, her hands cold despite the spring thaw outside. She hadn't eaten, hadn't drawn, hadn't gone to see Bramble, which is how her father knew something was wrong. By dusk, her body was a furnace. Sweat slicked her skin. Her lips muttered broken phrases through gritted teeth like she was arguing with someone in a dream. He carried her up to bed, wrapped her in every blanket he could find, placed cold towels on her head. But she didn't wake. Down in the barn, Bramble stirred. Not the slow, arthritic stretch of an old horse ready to sleep, but a jerk. A pivot ears, snapping forward as if summoned by a sound no human could hear. He pawed once at the ground, then again. Then the stall door trembled. Ellie's dream sharpened. She was barefoot, standing at the edge of a river, made of silver. Not water, not light, something in between. Mist hovered just above its surface. On the other side, her mother stood beneath a sky that pulsed like a heartbeat. Calm. Still. Her dress fluttered untouched by wind. Next to her, Bramble, younger, strong, black mane unruly in the strange starlight. Her mother didn't wave, didn't speak. She just extended one hand palm upward, waiting. Ellie took one step forward and the world spun. Upstairs, she gasped in her sleep. Her body arched, sweat soaking the sheets. Her father clutched her hand, helpless. And then from outside, the sound no one expected to hear. Wood cracking, metal wrenching, hooves pounding mud. Bramble had broken free. In 15 years, he'd never once left his stall on his own. Not when the gates were left open. Not in storms. Not during fires. But now, he was running. A streak of dark muscle through the paddock, breath steaming in the moonlight. His legs moved with urgency, not chaos. Purposeful. Like something older than instinct had taken hold of him. Ellie's father heard it too late. The pounding hooves, the frantic cry, the deep primal thud of an animal throwing itself against a door. He rushed down the stairs and flung open the front door, just as Bramble reared back and slammed his hooves into the porch rail. The horse's eyes met his wild shining, not with fear, but insistence. He backed up, let the door swing open. Bramble didn't enter. He turned, circled, and charged the side window, the one that looked directly into Ellie's bedroom. He stopped short, chest heaving, hooves scraping the earth. He reared once, let out a low, guttural sound, not a whinny, not a scream, more like a summons. Inside, Ellie's eyes flickered open, but she didn't speak. Her gaze moved to the window where moonlight spilled across the floor in a perfect rectangle. And in that light, his silhouette appeared. Bramble, still, towering, looking directly at her through the glass. She sat up slowly. Her father rushed in behind her, Ellie, but she didn't look at him. Her lips parted. He brought her back. Her father blinked. "What?" Ellie pointed at the window. "She's just on the other side." He turned. There was nothing, just a horse, a dying one, out of breath and shivering in the cold. "I saw her," Ellie said. "On the bridge." He carried her across, but she came back. Her voice was stronger now, clearer, like the fever was releasing her. Outside, Bramble stepped closer to the window, lowering his head, pressing the side of his neck, the withers to the glass. A mist formed instantly. Frost despite the spring warmth. The window fogged where his body touched it, and then a single handprint. Not a hoof, a handprint in the frost. Ellie smiled through her tears. "She told me I could stay." Her father said nothing. His world was collapsing and expanding at once. Bramble exhaled long and low. He backed away from the window slowly, as if satisfied. And then he turned. Without another sound, he walked back toward the paddock. Not running now. Just walking. As if he had fulfilled something. As if the message had been delivered. Back in her room, Ellie sank into her pillows, eyes fluttering shut. Her father stood beside her, watching as the fever finally broke. Outside, the silver moon hung low, and the frost on the window melted, except for the shape of that one small hand left behind in the cold. When Ellie opened her eyes that morning, the world was quieter than she remembered. Not silent, just still. Like something had shifted. Like something new to pause. Her father was asleep in the chair beside her bed, half slumped forward, arms crossed like armor. The window was still fogged from the night before, but the frost had melted, leaving only one strange, perfect shape in the glass, a single handprint. She sat up slowly. Her body ached, but her thoughts were sharp, urgent. She reached for her sketchbook. By the time the light poured through the blinds and touched her father's shoulder, Ellie was already finishing the drawing. He stirred, blinked. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" She didn't answer, not yet. Her pencil moved fast with purpose, no hesitation, no drafts. What emerged on the page wasn't a memory, it was a message. A black horse taller than real, younger than time. A silver river glowing like a ribbon in the dark. And her mother, eyes closed but peaceful arms around Bramble's neck as they crossed the water. But this time the water wasn't just beneath them, it shimmered through them, turning their bodies translucent, almost holy. Above the river floated a bridge made of moonlight and dust. Each plank held together by strands of song, visible drawn in musical notation floating between stars. Ellie shaded the final corner. Then, as if in a trance, she signed it with her mother's initials. She handed the page to her father without a word. He looked down, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, he didn't see a child's drawing. He saw her, his wife, alive somehow. And he didn't know what terrified him more, that his daughter had imagined it, or that she hadn't. He left the room like a man walking out of a burning building calm, only because panic had stopped working. Later that day, Grace walked through the front door of the ranch house and found Ellie in the kitchen waiting. Ellie said nothing. She simply slid the drawing across the table. Grace picked it up, and everything else fell away. The shading, the accuracy, the movement captured in stillness, the intimacy as if the girl had seen it with her own eyes, not just dreamed it. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. "It's her," Ellie whispered. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. But I knew. Grace wiped her cheek, forcing composure. "Ellie," she said, voice cracking, "where was the river?" Ellie touched the center of the drawing, the silver water. Between. That's what she called it. Not heaven, not gone, just between. By sunset, the entire ranch had heard the story. Not from gossip, not from rumor, but from Bramble himself. Because Bramble hadn't moved since that night. He stood facing the east fence, head low, eyes closed, like he was in prayer. No food, no sound. Just waiting. James said nothing, but his silence was full of meaning. The ranch hands kept their distance, but not Ellie's father. That night, something pulled him from sleep. Not noise, not light, just a pull. He stepped outside. The air was cold again. Not winter cold, not spring chill. Something older, something aware. He found Bramble standing by the outer edge of the paddock, still facing east, still unmoving. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, he walked to the animal. No commands, no hesitation. Just footsteps across wet ground. He stopped a few feet away. Bramble didn't move. "I don't believe in ghosts," he muttered. "I barely believe in God." Silence, but my daughter does. Still nothing. "She says you carried her." Bramble exhaled. A slow, warm breath, then turned his head slightly, just enough to expose the curve of his withers. Ellie's father stepped closer. One hand reached out, hovered, shook, then it touched. And the moment his palm landed on Bramble's neck, his knees almost buckled. Because it wasn't just cold. It was familiar, a temperature he hadn't felt since the hospital bed. Since the funeral parlor. Since the last time he kissed her forehead. And her skin had already gone stiff, already gone somewhere he couldn't follow. But here, it breathed. The cold had rhythm, the cold had shape. His fingers tightened. And then in the back of his skull, clear as thunder through glass, he heard it. A hum, not music, not words. Just the tune she used to sing to Ellie at bedtime. Low, repeating, like it had never left. He stumbled back. Sat hard in the mud. Gasped like a man surfacing from deep water. Bramble didn't move. He just stood there, letting the silence return. The next morning, Ellie found her father already awake, already dressed, already sitting by the paddock. He wasn't crying, but his face was open for the first time. "I think I heard her," he said. Ellie didn't ask who. She just nodded. "She used to hum," he continued. "Even when you were too old for lullabies." "I wasn't," Ellie whispered. He glanced at her. "No, I guess you weren't." The wind blew gently across the fields. And for a moment, just one, it moved through them. A breeze that didn't belong to any season. And Bramble, without moving, sighed. It was a long, heavy exhale, but not tired. Relieved. Ellie walked up to her father and placed the drawing into his hands. He looked at it again this time, seeing not just the image, but the invitation. "It's real," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the line between dream and truth, memory and miracle had already dissolved. And the silver river still ran just beyond the fence, waiting. It began on a Tuesday. There was nothing dramatic about the day. The sun was high. The birds were loud. The smell of cut grass drifted through the pastures like some quiet offering to summer. But Bramble didn't rise. James had noticed it first. He stood outside the paddock longer than usual that morning, hat in hand, watching the old horse lie still in the dirt, his ribs lifting only slightly with each breath. The others avoided him now, not out of fear, but reverence. Like even animals understood when a gate was closing. By noon, the temperature climbed. 27 degrees Celsius. Unseasonably warm. The wood on the barn doors had begun to sweat. The horses were led into shade. But Bramble never moved. Inside the house, Ellie had already begun preparing. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't explain. She walked to her mother's jewelry box, still unopened since the funeral, clicked the latch, and carefully lifted the silver chain from its velvet nest. The necklace had a pale blue stone in the center, smoothed down over time. It was warm in her palm, like it had absorbed years of skin and memory. Her mother had worn it every day for as long as Ellie could remember. It wasn't expensive, but it had weight. A small gasp escaped her as she closed her fingers around it. Then she left the house without a word. When she reached the paddock, James nodded and stepped aside. He didn't speak. Neither did her father, who watched from the edge of the fence like someone watching a slow, inevitable tide roll in. Ellie walked straight to Bramble. His eyes opened barely. The rest of him stayed still. His breaths were shallow now, not quite labored, just resigned, like a chapter already written, like a story that knew its last sentence. Ellie knelt beside him and gently touched the base of his neck, the place that had become their cathedral, the spot where whispers lived. Still cold. Even now, under an unrelenting sun with sweat on her brow and dust on her knees, the air around Bramble's withers felt like winter. A quiet, bone-deep chill that made her chest tighten with something that wasn't fear. She opened her hand and held up the necklace. "I brought it," she said softly. "You remember it, don't you?" Bramble's ear flicked. Ellie leaned in and pressed the chain gently to his fur. Her fingers trembled, but she was steady. "She loved this," Ellie said. "She wore it when she sang. She wore it when she told me stories. She wore it when she hugged you that day after the storm." Bramble exhaled a low, rumbling sound that almost didn't register. Ellie placed the necklace right at the center of his withers, laying it flat, letting the silver curve follow the ridge of his spine. The wind stirred, brushing her hair across her face. And she realized suddenly that it wasn't from the trees. It was him, Bramble, still breathing, still giving. Cold, constant wind lifted from his back, flowing up and around her face like fingers, like presence, like a hand brushing her cheek. Not sharp, not violent. Just there, the same breeze she'd felt every time she pressed her ear to that spot. The one that carried her mother's hum. The one that had lingered even when science said it shouldn't. Ellie placed her palm over the necklace, holding it gently in place. Her voice broke only slightly. "You don't have to carry her anymore," she whispered. "You brought her back. I saw her. I saw you both." She leaned down, her forehead resting against his shoulder. "Thank you." And then quieter. "Thank you, Mama." The barn was silent. No creaks, no distant calls. Even the flies had retreated. It was the kind of silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from reverence. A hush that holds space for goodbye. Her father approached slowly. He had not wept at the funeral. He had not held her hand during the procession. But now, seeing his daughter sitting beside the dying horse, her small body wrapped in memory and light, something inside him cracked. He knelt down across from her. Their hands nearly touched, separated only by Bramble's spine. The wind moved again, stronger this time. It lifted the edges of Ellie's hair, flared her shirt. Her father's eyes widened. He reached forward cautiously and placed his hand beside hers, on the same place over the necklace. And instantly he felt it. The cold, not dead cold, not grave cold, but holding cold. Like an embrace left behind in the air. Like someone had stayed not out of need, but out of love. His breath caught. For the first time he understood, not in the way science demands, but in the way a father must when the rules of the world are no longer enough to explain what his child believes. His hand closed gently over hers. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't want to believe." Ellie didn't answer, because nothing needed to be said. The sky dimmed slightly as a cloud passed over the sun. The temperature held, but around Bramble it felt like the seasons themselves had shifted. He exhaled again, one final deep breath that vibrated through the dirt. And then, stillness. No collapse, no drama, just stillness. But the wind did not stop. It continued to rise from his back, curling through the rafters, slipping under the doors, dancing through the grass outside. And the necklace, still resting in place, began to glint. Not just from sunlight, but from within. Ellie sat back. She didn't cry. Her face was calm, steady. Her mother's composure etched into her young features. She stood slowly and brushed her hands off on her jeans. She looked down at Bramble and nodded once. "We'll keep this here," she said, "so no one forgets." James stepped forward then, silently. He bent down and gathered a lock of Bramble's mane, tying it with a thin leather cord. "It's not the end," he said, voice low. "No," Ellie replied. "It's just the place they meet." She walked out of the barn, into the sunlight, her father following a few steps behind. The door remained open behind them, and from the far corner, A slow, persistent draft curled from the shadows, circling the necklace, brushing the hay, and carrying something invisible but undeniable through the rafters, like a song without lyrics. A song that said, I was here, I loved, I stayed, and that love still moves. The morning sun came early, indifferent to the night that had folded so much into silence. The barn stood still. The dew clung to the windows, catching the first rays of gold. The fields were quiet, reverent, as if nature itself had bent its head in mourning. No one had gone near Bramble's body yet. Not even James. Not even the crows. Ellie was the first to return. She walked barefoot, her steps slow but unwavering, the same path she had taken every afternoon for months. But this time the air didn't hum with presence. It stood empty. Still, she carried something in her hand, a clean cloth and her mother's old Polaroid camera. She stepped inside the barn. The floorboards didn't creak. Bramble's body lay where it had been the night before, peaceful, untouched. But something had changed. The necklace. It was still resting at the base of his neck, just where she'd placed it. The silver chain shimmered faintly, and the blue stone at its center had darkened now a deep ocean hue. But that wasn't what stopped her breath. Etched across the back of the stone in a script that hadn't been there before were words. Simple, uneven, not engraved by hand, but somehow burned into the silver. I'm still here, just through the horse, that's all. Ellie didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She simply stared, heart frozen in her chest, then slowly sat down beside Bramble and pressed her hand to the words. Her mother's voice echoed faintly, not in the air, but in her. She knew then that this wasn't goodbye. Not really. A few minutes later, her father arrived. His eyes were heavy red-rimmed from lack of sleep or something more. He stepped into the barn and stopped. He didn't speak. Ellie pointed to the necklace, but said nothing. He crossed the stall like a man moving underwater, every step deliberate. He knelt beside the horse, his hand hovering over Bramble's spine. Then, without a word, he lowered his forehead to that spot, the withers, the place Ellie had always gone. And for the first time since the day he'd identified his wife's body, he wept. Not quietly, not politely. The kind of crying that breaks through from somewhere ancient, where language no longer works. His shoulders shook. His palms pressed into Bramble's fur, his face buried in the scent of hay and dust and memory. And Bramble, though, still seemed to receive it. The barn filled with a strange stillness, not empty, but full. Like breath held, like time suspended. Outside, Grace waited. She had come to say goodbye. To Bramble. To something she couldn't quite name. She carried a small wooden box and a pair of scissors wrapped in linen. When Ellie walked out to meet her, they didn't speak. Grace simply opened the box, and Ellie nodded. Together, they returned to the stall. Grace knelt beside Bramble and whispered something in a language Ellie didn't understand. Something Ojibwe, perhaps? A prayer, a promise, a poem for the crossing, Then, with careful hands, Grace clipped a small lock of Bramble's mane, the finest part near the base of the neck, where the cold had always risen. She wrapped it in cloth, sealed it inside the box, and closed the lid gently. Ellie looked up. What will you do with it? Grace smiled, soft and broken. Keep it where it can speak. 2 weeks later, the box sat inside a glass case at the town's community center. Not front and center, not labeled with ceremony, just quietly placed on a pedestal near the east-facing window where morning light touched it first. A small brass plaque beneath it read, The Cold Withers, where love comes back to whisper. Word spread. People came quietly, humbly. Not tourists, not thrill-seekers, just those who had lost. A father who'd buried his son in winter. A woman who still made 2 cups of coffee every morning. A girl who hadn't spoken since her sister drowned. They stood before the case. Some reached out, some cried. Some laughed unexpectedly as if remembering something long buried. And always as they stood there, they felt it. A chill, not unpleasant, not terrifying, just sudden, right at the back of the neck. A windless cold. A memory come home. The center staff didn't question it. They left the window open more often. They placed a bench nearby. They started calling the exhibit unofficially the Cold Neck Bridge. It was Ellie's phrase that took hold. She'd explained it once softly during a classroom presentation about grief and memory. Someone had asked, "Do you think your mom really came back?" She'd paused, thought carefully. "I don't think she left," Ellie said. "She just changed rooms." Bramble was the hallway. It stuck. Soon people were calling it the hallway horse. A podcast did a piece on it. The town's newsletter printed a short poem a local teacher had written inspired by Bramble and the bridge across Silver Water. But for Ellie, none of that mattered. She still visited the barn, though Bramble's body had been buried beneath the old maple near the edge of the property. She sat on the grass, eyes closed, drawing again. always drawing. One afternoon, Grace joined her. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Grace asked, "Does it still feel cold?" Ellie opened her eyes. "Sometimes," she said, "when someone needs it to." Grace smiled. "So it's not for you anymore." Ellie shook her head. "It never was. I just heard it first." From the house, Ellie's father watched them. He held a mug of coffee in both hands, staring out the window like a man no longer afraid of silence. On the windowsill beside an old photo of his wife sat a folded slip of paper. On it, written in Ellie's careful script, was the inscription, "I'm still here. Just threw the horse, that's all." He didn't cry. He didn't need to, because some messages arrive louder when the sender is gone. Because some bridges don't need feet, just wind. And because love, when held at the base of the neck, doesn't burn, it cools and stays. The trouble began quietly like a crack in ice. You don't notice until your foot falls through. At first it was just whispers. A few parents at the local school started questioning the situation with Ellie, how she talked about the dead, how she believed in talking animals, how she sat in class and drew things that made the other children uncomfortable. One mother described Ellie's sketches as morbid mythology. Another called her a distraction wrapped in grief. Then came the administrative meetings. Grace was called in first. The principal, a man with framed certificates and dead plants lining his windowsill, cleared his throat 3 times before finally saying it. "You're encouraging spiritual ideas that go against district policy." Grace raised an eyebrow. Spiritual ideas. The idea that a dead horse is speaking. That it's a vessel for the deceased. "You've been letting Ellie present these beliefs in class." "She's not presenting," Grace said. "She's processing." But it didn't matter. The language turned colder. Disruption, instability, cultish overtones. They told her to take a leave of absence, without appeal. Outside, the air tasted like iron. Grace walked to her car, her bag heavier than usual, not from books, but from everything she wasn't allowed to say. Back at school, Ellie felt the shift immediately. Her friends, those who had once watched her draw with fascination, now avoided her desk. They whispered about the dead horse girl. Some refused to partner with her in group work. Others slid their chairs farther away. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was fear. Ellie had heard the word unclean whispered once in the hallway. Then came the church. A local pastor, pressed and polished, gave a sermon titled "False Idols in the Fields." No names, of course, but everyone knew. His voice echoed through the pews with practiced rhythm. "Beware the beasts to whom we give our grief. Beware those who call animals sacred, for they trade truth for comfort." A few days later, someone threw a stone through the window at the community center. The glass case holding Bramble's mane was cracked, the plaque beneath it stolen. James was the one who found it. He didn't report it. He didn't call the cops. He just stood there, staring at the empty pedestal. Then turned away and whispered, "It begins again." Ellie didn't understand. Until that night, she sat in her room trying to sketch through the noise in her head. But her hands trembled. Every time her pencil touched paper, the lines broke like the images inside her were falling apart. She looked down at her old drawing, Bramble crossing the Silver River with her mother on his back. And then she knew what had to be done. She tore a fresh sheet from the pad. This time she didn't draw one person. She drew many. Children, all kinds, boys, girls, small, tall. Some in wheelchairs, some holding hands, some with visible scars, some with downcast eyes. Each of them walked across a bridge made of light. And each of them held an animal in their arms. Some cradled cats, some rode dogs, some led birds on invisible strings. One boy hugged a stuffed rabbit so tight its fur peeled back. Another girl held a fish bowl. Another clung to a bridle with no horse. But on the other side of the bridge waiting were the shadows of those animals, fully formed alive in the glow. The page pulsed with color, with life. She titled it "The Welcome." Her father found her the next morning asleep at her desk, arms folded around the drawing like it was the last warm thing in the world. He studied it for a long time, and for the first time, he saw what she'd been trying to say. Not just about Bramble. Not just about her mother. About all of them. About every child who had ever lost someone or something and been told to forget. To move on. To act normal. He walked to the kitchen and called Grace. "I want to hold a gathering," he said. "For the ones who feel left behind." Grace on the other end was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "So do I." But not everyone agreed. The local council sent an email condemning the idea of hosting what they called a spiritual memorial on community grounds. Grief is personal, they said. It should not be politicized through animal stories and pseudoscience. Ellie heard the words from her father's mouth. She didn't cry, but she didn't speak for 3 days. Until she did, she stood on the porch one afternoon, sketchbook in hand, facing the wind. The old fence in the distance creaked. A bluebird landed on the post nearest Bramble's grave. She began to draw. She drew the case again. The cracked glass, the empty pedestal, but this time, instead of a plaque, she drew words etched in fire. They were never just animals. They were the ones who waited when no one else did. And beneath that, in tiny print, they brought us back to ourselves. That evening, the church hosted a youth gathering. Ellie didn't go, but someone slid a print of her new drawing under the door of the sanctuary. No note, no name. The pastor never mentioned it, but the next morning, the youth program quietly removed the phrase animal idolatry from their bulletin. Meanwhile, people started returning to the center. Not in crowds, not loudly, but they came. Mothers with locket necklaces, teenagers with tears they hadn't cried since their dogs were put down, elderly men with trembling hands who stared into the broken glass like it might still open. And when they touched the wood of the case, the cold came back, only for a second, but it was enough. Ellie sat at the edge of the grass that night, her knees pulled to her chest. Her father sat beside her, no words left to offer, and she said quietly, "Truth doesn't always win, but it never dies either." From the shadows, a breeze lifted the corner of her sketchbook, and she added one last line to the bridge drawing, just above the children, just beneath the stars. No one crosses alone. The year the cold came back was the year the world lost too much. Not just lives, connections, certainty. Names that had once filled phone calls and dinner tables began to vanish from calendars, from mailboxes, from memory. People didn't talk about it openly. Grief had become so common it started to feel impolite, and yet it lingered. In coughs behind closed doors, in sealed envelopes that never got mailed, in empty shoes still waiting by the door. Ontario was no different. The towns around the ridge carried their losses like invisible coats, too heavy to shed, too familiar to acknowledge. And then on a late October afternoon, something shifted. Grace had kept the key to the case, to the building, to the door of belief that had been nailed shut months earlier. She never told anyone exactly why she went back. She just did, quietly. No banners, no announcements. Just a note slipped under the door of the senior center. Just a message left on the back of a church bulletin. Just a drawing of a hand on a horse's neck pinned to a grocery store corkboard. At 4:30 p.m. it began to rain. Not hard. Just enough to turn the roads slippery and the sky a little darker than it should have been. By 500, a dozen people had gathered outside the community center. No one said why they were there. They just were. And then the door opened. Inside, the lights were low. The room smelled faintly of cedar and something older, like wool, like earth, like stillness. The glass case remained now whole again. The lock of Bramble's mane lay undisturbed, and beside it, a new plaque. You may not believe in ghosts, but they believe in you. The first to approach the case was a woman in her 80s. She walked with a cane, her white hair pulled back in a long braid. Her name was Mrs. Keene. Everyone knew her from the post office, but few knew she had lost her husband to the virus just 5 months earlier. She didn't speak. She simply approached the case, removed one glove, and placed her hand gently on the wood. She closed her eyes, a long-held breath, and then her hand trembled, not from age, from something else, a current, a whisper. She gasped softly and muttered, "He said my name." Grace stepped forward but didn't speak, just stood nearby. Mrs. Keene turned her eyes, filled but not broken. "He said my name," she repeated louder now. "He said, Annalise." Just like he used to when he was happy. Like Sunday mornings. A hush settled over the room. Not doubt, not disbelief. Just hunger, for more, for meaning, for something they'd all been afraid to ask for. A few more stepped forward. A teenager who had lost his brother. A man who hadn't spoken since his daughter died. A mother who carried her son's baby shoes in her purse. One by one, they laid hands on the glass, the case, the space around it. Some cried, some smiled, one just laughed. And in each of them, something thawed. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, the air began to shift, not warmer, not colder, just fuller. At the back of the room, a little boy sat with a crayon and a folded piece of paper. He didn't speak much, never had, since his mother passed. But now he drew. When he finished, he walked to the front and slid the drawing into the space beneath the case. Grace picked it up. It showed a child riding a horse made of stars. Behind them, a woman smiled, her hands reaching forward. Above them was a sky filled with words too small to read, and at the bottom, in shaky handwriting, the sentence, "I think my mom is writing somewhere good. I'm not scared anymore." No one spoke after that for a long time. Grace closed the drawing into a folder, tears smudging the edge. The cold was back. Not the kind you curse, not the kind you run from. The kind that reminded you someone had been close once and might be again. News began to spread, not fast, but steady, that there was a place where the air remembered. That a horse once held grief so deep it froze time, and now, years later, that grief was opening its arms to everyone else who had carried their own silently. They started calling it again the Cold Withers, but this time they came on purpose. Ellie watched from a distance. She no longer felt alone in the weight of memory. She no longer flinched when people whispered. Because now they whispered something different. I felt it. It knew his name. It wasn't just in my head. And for the first time since Bramble passed, Ellie opened her sketchbook again. Not out of need, but out of gratitude. She began a new drawing. A wide open field filled with children, not sad, not lost, but walking toward a single shape at the horizon. A great dark horseback turned wind curling from its neck like a banner of smoke and silk, and every child smiled, because every one of them had finally heard something they'd waited a lifetime to feel. Their name, spoken back. By the end of that autumn, the people who once mocked the wind at the withers began lining up for it. They came quietly. Not for prayer, not for spectacle, but to feel if only for a few seconds that they were not the only ones left behind. The cold withers once called foolish, blasphemous, dangerous had become something else entirely. A sanctuary. Not of religion, not of ritual, but of sensation, of memory, of unspoken connection. No signs announced it, no advertisements ran, but still they came. A woman with her husband's wedding ring in a pouch. A teen who hadn't spoken since his brother's accident. A man who wrote his daughter's name on his palm every morning so he wouldn't forget it by nightfall. They arrived, sat quietly in the cedar room, and waited for the wind. Sometimes it came like a soft push against the collarbone. Other times, just a whisper that curled behind the ear, the kind you mistake for breath if you're afraid to believe it's something more. But always when they left, their shoulders seemed lighter, and no one left without touching the glass. The center, once empty most weekdays, began hosting 3 to 4 open hours daily. Grace stood in the back of the room, never guiding, never preaching, just watching. She kept a basket of blank note cards near the display. Soon they filled with messages. I never got to say I'm sorry. You still hum in my dreams. Your dog still sleeps on my bed. Sometimes I think he sees you. And then one day, a little boy scrawled, Dear horse, tell Grandma I finished the puzzle. I didn't cheat. Grace placed that card in the case, right next to the lock of Bramble's mane. People didn't cry as much as they used to, not because it hurt less, but because the pain no longer had to be carried alone. One morning, Ellie's father showed up at the center with gloves, boots, and a shovel. He didn't ask permission. He just began digging. Right behind the building at the far end of the lot where the grass grew wild and the earth still held the scent of hay, he broke ground. By noon, 3 others had joined him. By dusk, the hole was cleared, the soil turned, the space shaped. A circle. At its center, a modest stone. No name, no date. Just one word carved into it by hand. Bramble. And around it, Ellie's father planted 9 maple saplings, all spaced evenly, all facing outward like sentries around a campfire. Each tree came from a different home. Donated, dug up, transplanted. Grace brought one. James brought another. A girl who had never met Bramble brought one for her cat. There was no speech. But when the last shovel hit dirt, the wind moved again, cold, immediate, familiar. And the leaves on the youngest maple trembled. It took weeks, but they all took root. And one afternoon, Ellie came back. She stood in the middle of the ring of trees, her hair longer now, her boots worn down from walking the same stretch of land over and over again. The air was warm early spring, not a cloud in sight. She walked toward the case again. It stood just as it always had, glass, smooth plaque, intact, lock untouched. Inside, Bramble's mane hadn't changed. Still soft, still golden brown, still curling slightly at the edges like it missed the wind. Ellie placed both hands on the glass and closed her eyes. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't expect anything. She just stood there and listened. A leaf stirred on the maple tree closest to the window. She heard it fall. And when she opened her eyes, it was resting on the center of the case, its red tip curled perfectly over the etched brass words. She smiled, reached out, touched the leaf gently. It was cool to the touch, unseasonably so. The kind of cool you feel behind your knees when someone's about to say something that matters. The kind that makes your breath catch before your voice does. Her father stood behind her now. He didn't speak. She turned to him, held up the leaf, and said quietly, She's gone now. He nodded, uncertain. But the love isn't. Ellie continued. It never really leaves. It just finds new ways to move. She placed the leaf on the glass again, gently pressing it into the spot where Bramble's withers once rose and fell with life. And then she added, her voice soft, strong, certain. Mom's gone, but she left enough of herself behind. The next day, the center opened a new exhibit. Just one framed piece, Ellie's drawing. Children crossing a silver bridge. Arms wrapped around dogs, birds, turtles, plush toys, even empty collars. At the top, the title, No One Crosses Alone. And just beneath, in her mother's handwriting, taken from an old birthday card, Love rides where we cannot. But it leaves hoofprints behind. They say communities are built through churches, schools, grocery stores. But in that corner of Ontario, they now say something else. Communities are built where pain has a place to stay without being told to leave. And that place was a cold gust, a silent horse, and a little girl who listened. The room is quiet. Only the sound of wind brushes faintly against the old wooden window panes. The kind of wind that slips beneath doors without permission. Ellie sits in front of the camera alone. She's older now. Not much, but her face carries something deeper. Not just time, not just grief. Knowing. Her sketchbook rests in her lap, closed for once. The light from a single lamp warms one side of her face, the rest lit by morning slipping in through a window behind her. There's no set, no makeup. Just a chair, a small table with a folded letter, and the space between things like breath held at the edge of a memory. She looks into the lens and speaks. "Hi, Mom. I wrote you something. I don't know if it'll reach wherever you are. But maybe, if it rides the right wind, maybe you'll hear it." She unfolds the letter. Her voice is steady. No tremble, no pause. Just truth. "I'm not going to ask why you left. I used to want to. I used to scream into pillows, into the barn, into the walls. I wanted a reason, an answer. I thought if I understood the why, I'd feel better. But I don't need that anymore, because I know you didn't leave completely." She takes a breath. The kind you only take when it hurts to keep going, but you do it anyway. "I know now that you stayed. In the wind, in Bramble's back, in the cold that touched my skin when the world stopped making sense. You stayed in the way I learned to love others, even when it hurt. You stayed in the way I started listening more and talking less. You stayed in every child who came to touch the glass and left with eyes that said, 'Someone knows I'm still here.'" A tear slips down her cheek. She doesn't wipe it. "I used to think stories were things you told before bed. But now I think they're maps. You gave me mine. And it led me back to you, again and again." She closes the letter, looks down. Then softly but with unshakable clarity she says, "Thank you, Mom, for the wind, for Bramble, for staying even when you had to go." The screen fades to black. Then slowly light returns. It's morning, early, golden. We see the field, wide, open, endless. Mist still curls near the treetops, but sunlight has begun to break through in soft, splintered shafts. And there at the far end of the paddock is Ellie, crouched beside a young foal. The horse is dark like Bramble, but smaller, curious. Its mane already carries a slight wave. Ellie whispers something to it, not with her mouth, but with her presence. The horse leans its head toward her shoulder. A beat. Then she rises, pulls herself onto the bareback of the animal, not with force, but with invitation. She rides slowly at first, letting the horse find its rhythm, letting her breath sink with its gait. Then faster. They break into a canter, then a run. Camera widens. Ellie's hair whips behind her. Her hands are not gripping, just resting. Her back is straight, her chest open, her face tilted into the wind. And then, a shift. Her head turns slightly. The breeze catches the edge of her collar and lifts it. She feels it. The cold, right at the base of her neck. She closes her eyes, smiles. The wind swirls around her, not just a breeze now, but a presence. It dances along her shoulders, curves along the horse's mane, trails behind them in a silver ribbon of motion. The foal does not slow. Together they cut across the golden field like a memory learning how to move again. The camera pulls even wider. No fences, no barriers, just girl, horse, and the wind that carries everything they've ever lost, but never forgotten. In the final moment, the horse slows, comes to a gentle stop near the top of a hill. Ellie dismounts, stands still. She looks back, not at the camera, not at the barn, but at the path behind her where hoof prints sink deep in the soft earth. She reaches up and places one hand against the back of her neck, then turns her face to the sky and whispers something we don't hear, but we feel it. The screen fades to white, and over it, these words appear etched slowly, as if spoken by something invisible, but close. Not every spirit leaves. Some love finds its way back through wind, through withers, through things no one believes. Except the children.